Donald Trump, he has woken up and tweeted on his Truth Social, threatening tariffs on alcoholic drinks from the EU.
In 2023, French automaker Stellantis reported a 21% year-over-year increase in global battery electric vehicle, BEV, sales. What happens when a country doesn't retaliate with tariffs, but with dominance? While the United States focuses on domestic reshoring, France, through Stellantis and Renault, is expanding its global footprint, building electric vehicle infrastructure, and closing supply chain gaps. Is this France's strategic counterstrike against U.S. auto dominance? How are its car makers undercutting American brands across Europe and emerging markets? And has France just redefined how industrial power is exercised? Under growing pressure from Washington's evolving trade policies, Europe's patience began to wear thin. For France, a country with deep industrial roots and a strong automotive legacy, the most recent round of American tariffs on European goods marked more than a policy dispute. It was a wake-up call. While the United States did not formally announce sector-specific tariffs targeting French automakers, the broader tension in transatlantic trade relations had clear implications. France, like several of its European neighbors, understood that without a coordinated economic response, its industrial influence could gradually erode in the face of an increasingly protectionist American market. At the heart of France's concern was the automotive sector. It may not ship high volumes of passenger vehicles directly to American consumers, but France remains deeply integrated into global automotive supply chains, exporting precision components, electric vehicle parts, and specialized manufacturing systems that support cross-border production. Any disruption in trade channels with the United States, even if indirect, affects investment planning, supplier contracts, and long-term expansion strategies. The sense in Paris was not that a direct attack had occurred, but that the foundations of economic cooperation were shifting in ways that disadvantaged European manufacturers. While Germany often takes the spotlight in European vehicle exports, France's automakers, led by groups like Stellantis and Renault, remain essential players in the evolving electric vehicle landscape. These companies have long relied on access to international markets, including North America, to stay competitive. With rising uncertainty around tariff schedules, emissions compliance, and domestic subsidy schemes in the United States, French industry analysts began warning of potential commercial displacement, not through direct confrontation, but by gradual exclusion. Rather than wait for more concrete trade restrictions to be implemented, French policymakers and industry leaders quietly recalibrated their strategy. The goal was not to engage in open economic retaliation, but to protect France's long-term position by focusing on markets where it could outcompete American brands. Within European borders, this meant reinforcing the advantages French cars already held: compliance with European Union emission standards, locally integrated production, and access to EU-wide subsidies for clean mobility. As U.S. brands navigated the complexities of EU regulations, French models increasingly became the default choice for cost-conscious and environmentally minded consumers. American vehicles, particularly large SUVs and pickup trucks, faced a difficult road in Europe, with rising fuel prices, stricter insurance categories, and carbon taxes expanding across the region. Many of these vehicles simply could not compete on price or practicality. In cities like Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, consumer preference continued to shift towards smaller, hybrid or electric models, segments in which French automakers had a strong advantage. At the same time, French manufacturers were quietly expanding into emerging regions where they already had cultural, diplomatic, or logistical advantages. Renault's operations in North Africa, for example, have long benefited from established plants, low labor costs, and favorable trade agreements with countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. With more global automakers turning their attention to Africa as the next frontier for vehicle demand, France was already positioned to lead. These weren't just legacy relationships, they were actively maintained through new joint ventures, industrial park development, and credit facilities tied to French export financing agencies. In Latin America, Stellantis pushed harder into Brazil and Argentina, capitalizing on its diverse brand portfolio and leveraging flexible platforms to meet local regulatory requirements. Again, these were not territories that American automakers had entirely abandoned, but their presence was less agile. French firms benefited from quicker rollout of low-emission vehicles and tailored models that met both cost and performance expectations. Local partnerships in assembly and distribution made it easier to respond to shifts in consumer demand, giving French automakers a visible edge. These quiet gains were not framed as retaliation against the United States, but they undeniably had a cumulative impact. By reinforcing their grip in Europe and expanding into contested international regions, French carmakers reduced their dependence on trade with North America. In a world where industrial policy increasingly overlaps with foreign policy, such shifts carry weight. The strategic repositioning was not hostile, but it was deliberate. While American automakers continued to deal with inconsistent domestic policies, supply chain disruptions, and a fragmented approach to electrification, France moved forward with a more coordinated agenda. The government supported industry R&D through national and EU-level grants, accelerated infrastructure investment in electric charging networks, and pushed for stronger environmental standards that happened to align well with French manufacturing priorities. This created a regulatory environment that favored domestic producers and complicated entry for foreign rivals. Meanwhile, France's approach to trade negotiations increasingly reflected these priorities. Within the European Union, French officials advocated for stricter enforcement of environmental compliance on imports, a move that did not name the United States directly, but raised the barrier for any foreign automaker lacking a green supply chain. Product origin, emissions during production, and recycling policies became part of the import equation, subtly disadvantageous to competitors without robust climate policies. The net effect was that American automotive brands were not blocked, but they were increasingly filtered out. Consumers, regulators, and even dealers began shifting their focus toward vehicles that were built closer to home, emitted less, and qualified for national incentives. This wasn't a formal counterstrike, but in practice, the results were similar. France's share of vehicle sales grew in its home market and in strategic international regions, while American firms saw their margin for growth narrow. Executives in Detroit and other U.S. auto hubs took notice. Although few would publicly link sales challenges in Europe to policy misalignment, internal memos and investor reports flagged growing trade friction and regulatory divergence as a threat to global competitiveness. American brands were still dominant domestically, but abroad they were facing headwinds, some of which stemmed not from customer demand, but from missteps in adapting to the changing rules of global trade. As one European auto analyst put it, France hasn't declared war on the U.S. auto industry, they're just playing the long game better. That sentiment captures the reality behind the headlines. No single policy, speech, or tariff defined the shift. But taken together, France's economic strategy increasingly placed its carmakers in a position to thrive, while American counterparts struggled to adjust. If this pattern holds, it won't be the result of explosive confrontations or dramatic announcements. It will be the product of methodical planning, smart positioning, and a deep understanding of how industrial power is sustained over time. For now, the shift is quiet, but its effects are already being felt on both sides of the Atlantic. As France continued consolidating its automotive strategy at home and abroad, another layer of pressure quietly emerged, one that placed American automakers at a growing disadvantage across multiple global fronts. While French carmakers were not only stabilizing their domestic base but also expanding into high-growth regions, United States brands found themselves navigating an increasingly fragmented global market, where cost structures, regulatory barriers, and consumer sentiment were no longer tilted in their favor. In Europe, the situation was becoming more complex for American manufacturers. The regulatory environment had tightened considerably, with the European Union advancing its Fit for 55 initiative, a package of legislation aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions across member states. This policy package directly affected automotive imports, raising the bar on emissions standards, life cycle assessments, and sustainability reporting. French automakers, already aligned with these evolving requirements, had a smoother transition. Their supply chains were more localized, their models more compact and emissions-friendly, and their production processes increasingly backed by EU-compliant energy mixes. American brands, on the other hand, were still adapting to their own domestic challenges. Electrification strategies were not fully synchronized across all manufacturers. Charging infrastructure varied significantly by state, and while government incentives did exist, the lack of a unified national policy made it difficult for United States automakers to match the pace of European deployment. Vehicles produced in the United States and exported to Europe had to meet increasingly stringent compliance standards, pushing up costs and narrowing profit margins. As European markets moved toward stricter zero-emission targets, the competitive edge tilted further toward regional manufacturers. Consumers seeking environmentally responsible vehicles gravitated toward homegrown options, not only because they were compliant, but because they were perceived as more reliable in the long run. For French brands like Renault and Peugeot, this sentiment translated into a rise in dealership activity and stronger brand loyalty. In contrast, American models struggled to maintain relevance, especially in segments where price, emissions, and efficiency were closely scrutinized. Yet the friction wasn't confined to the European continent. French carmakers were gaining ground in regions where they had previously been secondary players. In Southeast Asia, for example, Stellantis expanded its manufacturing footprint through joint ventures and partnerships, particularly in Vietnam and Malaysia. These countries, now investing heavily in automotive industrial zones, welcomed European collaboration as a way to modernize production capabilities and reduce reliance on Chinese or American imports. The result was an influx of French brands into showrooms, offering mid-range, fuel-efficient vehicles that met local preferences and emission expectations. Meanwhile, in India, Renault maintained a steady market presence with compact models tailored to local demands. Although competition from domestic and Japanese brands remained strong, the French approach, emphasizing affordability, low running costs, and modern styling, ensured a continued foothold in one of the world's most competitive markets. American automakers, by contrast, had reduced their presence. General Motors exited the Indian market in 2017, and Ford followed suit in 2021, citing challenges related to scale and profitability. This widening global footprint gave French automakers more room to maneuver in international negotiations. As more of their revenue came from diverse sources, they became less vulnerable to single market shocks. Even as transatlantic tensions persisted, the strategic diversification into Asia, Africa, and Latin America offered a buffer against economic volatility. It also enabled French brands to invest confidently in long-term innovation, knowing that their exposure to policy shifts in any one country, such as the United States, was limited. Alongside this geographic spread, France made significant investments in industrial self-sufficiency. One of the key pillars was battery production. In recent years, France, in collaboration with Germany, launched major initiatives to develop homegrown electric vehicle battery manufacturing capacity. This was not just about supply, it was about reducing reliance on imports from Asia and building a resilient domestic ecosystem that could support the full electric vehicle production cycle. The Automotive Cells Company, a joint venture involving Stellantis, Mercedes-Benz, and Total Energies, marked a turning point in European battery independence. With factories under construction in France and Germany, the supply of locally produced, EU-compliant battery cells was set to scale significantly over the next 3 years. American manufacturers, in contrast, remained heavily dependent on battery imports from East Asia, particularly China and South Korea. While efforts to localize battery production in the United States had begun, they were still in the early stages. As a result, American electric vehicle models often carried higher embedded costs due to longer supply chains, exposure to foreign currency fluctuations, and vulnerabilities tied to raw material access. France's strategic focus on industrial sovereignty provided it with a cost advantage and improved control over future innovation cycles. This shift was also cultural. Within France, the government emphasized the importance of economic sovereignty as part of a broader strategy to protect strategic industries. This included incentives for reshoring production, investing in research and development, and supporting workforce upskilling and advanced manufacturing. The rhetoric was clear: resilience, independence, and regional integration. These themes resonated in policy documents and public speeches alike, reinforcing the idea that French industry, particularly in sectors like automotive and energy, must be anchored in domestic capability. In global supply chains, this translated into prioritized procurement from European suppliers, reduced reliance on US-based components, and greater bargaining power in international contracts. French firms were increasingly able to offer turnkey solutions, vehicles with domestically sourced batteries, assembled in EU-compliant factories, delivered through integrated logistics channels, all while meeting sustainability and traceability benchmarks. These capabilities gave French automakers a decisive edge when bidding for public and private fleet contracts across Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. From a consumer perspective, this investment in localism translated into better pricing, faster service availability, and growing trust in French brands. Buyers across Europe and emerging markets began to associate French cars not only with affordability, but also with resilience, reliability, and alignment with national goals. American brands, while still respected for performance and brand heritage, were often seen as less adaptable to local regulations and slower in product localization. At the same time, France's strategic positioning within the European Union allowed it to influence broader policy direction. In Brussels, French officials played a key role in shaping environmental benchmarks and advocating for stricter border adjustment mechanisms tied to carbon emissions. These policies, while rooted in environmental goals, also had economic implications. They made it more difficult for non-EU automakers to undercut European firms on price without matching the same environmental performance. Taken together, these developments were not part of a reactionary plan to undermine the United States automotive sector. Rather, they formed the contours of a long-term strategy to strengthen France's competitiveness in a rapidly changing global market. Yet the consequence remained. As France's auto industry grew more self-reliant, more international, and more deeply integrated into policy frameworks, it became a more formidable competitor to American brands, not through retaliation, but through reinvention. By 2024, the contrast was increasingly stark. French automakers were stabilizing production, expanding international presence, and leading in regulatory compliance. United States manufacturers were contending with domestic policy fragmentation, rising input costs, and inconsistent access to global markets. The gap was not yet unbridgeable, but the direction of travel was clear. France had not pulled the trigger in the traditional sense, but it had reshaped the landscape in ways that fundamentally challenged the United States' position in the global auto sector. While France's automakers expanded their international presence and fortified their position within the European Union, another shift was unfolding, one that exposed deeper vulnerabilities in the global auto industry's supply chain. This shift wasn't sparked by political statements or headline-grabbing trade moves. It came from years of strategic planning aimed at securing the building blocks of the electric vehicle revolution. As demand for electric vehicles surged worldwide, so too did the demand for the raw materials and technologies behind them. And France had been quietly positioning itself to control more of that equation. Unlike traditional internal combustion vehicles, electric vehicles rely heavily on high-value components like lithium-ion batteries, semiconductors, and rare earth materials. These materials are essential for performance, range, safety, and cost. As governments around the world introduced regulations favoring low-emission transport, demand for these components skyrocketed. But the global supply of critical inputs remained highly concentrated, especially in China and parts of South America. France recognized early on that building a competitive electric vehicle industry required control not only over manufacturing, but over the entire upstream supply chain. The government, in coordination with major French automakers and industrial players, invested in battery technology, semiconductor design, and resource partnerships. One of the clearest examples of this approach was the formation of battery consortia, like the Automotive Cells Company. These efforts were not only about producing battery packs at scale, but about reshaping who controlled the intellectual property, the energy sourcing, and the recycling loops involved. France aimed to move from being a buyer of technology to a co-owner of it. With new gigafactories under construction in the north of the country and across the border in Germany, the foundation was being laid for domestic battery production that would be protected from foreign pricing shocks or export restrictions. American automakers, though well-capitalized and ambitious, faced different challenges. Many were still dependent on Asian suppliers for battery materials and electronic systems. While the United States had announced large investments into domestic production through public-private initiatives, the actual build-out lagged behind that of France and the broader European Union. Additionally, environmental and permitting regulations in the United States sometimes slowed mining and battery facility approvals, creating a bottleneck in the early phases of supply chain localization. France's advantage was not in size, but in coherence. Every aspect of its industrial strategy, from mining partnerships in Africa to recycling plants for old batteries, was tied to national planning and EU-wide coordination. These systems were designed not only to serve domestic production, but to reduce dependence on any single trade partner. In markets increasingly shaped by geopolitical risk, this approach gave French manufacturers insulation from trade volatility. Parallel to this, French innovation in affordable electric vehicle segments accelerated. Unlike the United States, where electric vehicles have often been positioned as premium or performance-based products, France targeted the mass market. Brands like Renault pushed forward with sub-€25,000 electric vehicles aimed at first-time buyers and urban commuters. These models were not just cost-effective, they were designed to qualify for government incentives in France and across the European Union. The pricing strategy was backed by local production and short logistics chains, further reducing overall costs. In the United States, price remained a sticking point for electric vehicle adoption. While companies like Tesla, Ford, and General Motors introduced more models, Average prices for electric vehicles remained high compared to internal combustion vehicles. Though federal subsidies helped narrow the gap, many American consumers remained hesitant to transition, especially in regions where charging infrastructure was limited. In contrast, French policy included not just purchase incentives, but also investments in charging networks, priority road access, and scrappage schemes, all aligned to accelerate the shift away from petrol-powered transport. As these domestic efforts took hold, French automakers also began leveraging their strength in international markets. In several African and Middle Eastern countries, France had long-standing trade relationships dating back decades. This foundation was repurposed for the electric era. French companies worked with governments to set up local assembly plants, battery servicing centers, and training programs. These moves were not presented as alternatives to American vehicles, but were increasingly viewed as superior options in terms of cost, support, and long-term serviceability. United States automakers, by comparison, had a more fragmented presence in these same regions. While American brands remained popular in certain vehicle segments, particularly full-size pickups and SUVs, they lacked the localized networks and region-specific product lines that French firms had built. Without these, responding to local regulatory changes or consumer demands became more difficult. The strength of the French model was not just in exporting vehicles, it was in exporting a system. The combination of vehicle design, component control, local assembly, financing tools, and after-sales infrastructure gave France a full-spectrum offering. This allowed governments and fleet operators in emerging economies to engage with French brands as partners, not just suppliers. Simultaneously, back in Europe, French vehicles continued to gain ground in segments where American brands had once hoped to compete. Fleet contracts for municipal transport, government agencies, and ride-sharing companies increasingly favored local manufacturers. Not only were these vehicles compliant with new emission standards, but they also came with ecosystem advantages, integrated maintenance services, real-time fleet management, and compatibility with European smart city networks. These were areas where French firms had spent years building capabilities, while United States automakers were still developing similar offerings. In some cases, the challenge for American brands wasn't technical, but regulatory. In France and across the European Union, new rules around digital security, emissions reporting, and vehicle-to-grid communication created barriers to entry for imported vehicles that lacked the necessary certifications or hardware. While these regulations were applied equally to all foreign automakers, the effect was disproportionately felt by those without local adaptation teams or in-market R&D. French brands, having built their systems within these frameworks, had no such difficulties. All these factors converged to paint a picture of a global auto landscape where France was no longer merely defending its market share, it was advancing. And while none of these developments amounted to an explicit effort to target or undermine American manufacturers, the result was undeniable. French automakers were steadily eroding the international reach of their U.S. counterparts. What began as an effort to protect domestic industry in the face of trade uncertainty had evolved into a confident, proactive push toward global leadership. By the end of 2023, trends across multiple regions confirmed the shift. In parts of Europe, French brands accounted for the majority of new electric vehicle registrations. In North Africa and the Middle East, their assembly partnerships outpaced those of other Western brands. In South America and Southeast Asia, new dealership networks and training hubs were being established at a steady pace. France had moved beyond policy reaction. It was now defining what the new auto economy could look like, and American firms, while still strong, found themselves adjusting to a reality in which they were no longer the automatic default. The message wasn't that the United States auto industry had been pushed out, but that it was being outmaneuvered. French carmakers were not riding a wave of nationalist protectionism or trade retaliation. They were executing a long-term plan rooted in regional integration, clean energy alignment, and strategic expansion. And the space they were carving out was not shrinking, it was expanding in every direction. As pressure mounted in early 2025, France found itself navigating two fronts. On one hand, advancing its automotive industry's global momentum, and on the other, responding to renewed economic pressure from Washington. President Trump's latest move to impose tariffs on European steel and aluminum reignited fears of a transatlantic trade war. But this time, France had more to protect. Its car makers weren't just surviving, they were thriving, and any escalation risked disrupting a position of growing strength. Unlike past trade disputes, France didn't push for emotional retaliation. Instead, it influenced the European Union's strategic response with surgical focus. Behind closed doors, Paris lobbied for selective pressure, tools that could defend European industry without triggering full-scale economic retaliation. French officials raised concerns about targeting products like American whiskey and motorcycles, worried that miscalculated moves might backfire, especially for industries like French cognac and aerospace. The real leverage, they argued, lay in reinforcing the sectors where Europe, and particularly France, had a clear edge: clean tech, electrification, and industrial self-reliance. As talks intensified in Brussels, France was among the loudest voices urging the EU to activate its anti-coercion instrument, a recently approved trade defense tool designed to counter economic bullying. While it had never been used before, France saw this moment as a test of Europe's resolve. The instrument would allow for calibrated retaliation, not blanket tariffs, giving France room to shield strategic sectors like electric vehicles and batteries while sending a clear message to Washington. Meanwhile, French automakers remained calm but alert. They had no interest in direct confrontation, but were prepared to adjust production timelines and sourcing strategies if tensions escalated. Unlike earlier years, they now had the infrastructure and political backing to stay agile. From EV plants in Eastern Europe to supplier bases across North Africa, the French supply chain was less exposed than before. If anything, the moment only confirmed the wisdom of the country's long-term industrial repositioning. By mid-March, France had made its stance clear: retaliate if necessary, but never recklessly. The road ahead might be uncertain, but unlike in past disputes, France wasn't responding from a position of vulnerability. It was responding from strength. That brings us to the end of today's breakdown. If you've followed the story this far, you clearly care about the bigger picture, so make sure to check out the other videos on the channel.